Yes, thank you, Lakshmi. So I'm sort of jumping straight in. Um, I think the case has been made pretty well that brands and their suppliers, their manufacturers, have to meet requirements in terms of compliance. The brands pass their responsibilities or their requirements onto their manufacturers, and so on. And then, of course, the challenge is the lack of visibility down the supply chain, coupled with the challenges in terms of informal workers and in particular home workers being able to be organized and being able to interact with any sort of system. So if you think about deploying technology that, for example, could automate some of the processes in the supply chain, there's a challenge for home workers and informal workers in terms of being able to access that technology. And there's also a challenge that where exploitation takes place, the automation afforded by the technology could automate that exploitation equally. So when we looked at the approach in terms of, well, how do we look at how technology can support, the key point was really to start with this idea of a collective. And I'm using the term generically. It's any community-based organization that will help to organize those workers to provide the necessary training to help them to fight for their rights, to help them to get access to government support and so on. Also, that training and upskilling that we were hearing about from our previous speaker. And so in that context, that's the starting point of any technology deployment if it has a chance of succeeding. So what we've done is we've looked at the possible interventions, and you'll see across the bottom of this that of this slide that we've kind of outlined a sort of a staged approach, a roadmap, if you will, that are based around a collective-led intervention using technology that then starts to capture data on the situation for home workers, the working conditions, what work is being carried out, how many hours are being worked, what type of work, what rates are being paid, that could then be used to establish a regular rhythm of reporting within the collective, and then that could then be used by the collective to fuel engagements with other supply chain actors. But also it could be automated and made available via a portal that would allow brands and suppliers to be able to register and view that data. Now, an important thing here is the role of the collective in this context. So that data would be anonymized and aggregated at the collective level. So what information is shared isn't traceable to an individual, but is traceable to a collective and to a location possibly, in such a way that it's protecting the privacy of individual workers and supporting the collective in its ability to represent and support its members, these informal workers. So those are the first two stages of the intervention, and I'll describe that in a bit more detail on the next slide. If we establish this pattern, then actually by designing the system carefully, we could effectively have for want of a better description, a cookie cutter approach, which would mean that same basic capability, including that data reporting, could then be taken up and adopted by other collectives. These don't have to be new organizations. They can be existing organizations, but the important thing is establishing a common data format that will allow information to be aggregated in such a way that brands and suppliers get a richer picture of what is happening amongst home workers associated with different collectives and in different geographies, so that it creates much greater visibility within the supply chain. As that scales, then there is then an opportunity to introduce more automation into the supply chain by bringing in other supply chain actors in order to create what's referred to as a digital supply chain. So that's a staged approach. We anticipate that it will take time, as has already been mentioned, because it's closely tied to the establishment of that collective. And the deployment of the technology will be used to support that and to provide this sort of visibility up the supply chain to brands and suppliers as the technology is deployed. Just bear with me. Oh, there we go. There was a slight delay in my slides. So there are a number of factors in terms of that technology deployment. And you'll see here, I've highlighted the issue of access, which is shown by a dashed red box. We've already talked about the low levels of ownership of smartphones, but that has been increasing. We've heard also about the fact that the workers have been trained to use their smartphones and to use applications such as WhatsApp, including recording voice messages. So where people cannot read and write, they can interact with the system. And so we've looked at the potential to sort of build different approaches. And in particular, what we've looked at is the potential to introduce a voice interface that would allow workers to be able to report on the work that they have done on a regular basis, just using a normal telephone call, where they would respond to a number of questions, for example, and be able to provide the information that could be collated. In the situation where the worker doesn't have access to any kind of telephone to use that voice interface, it could also be supported by an intermediary, a representative of the collective, who could help to do that. And obviously there are issues in terms of making sure that that is done with the authorization of the worker, and that is done in such a way as it protects privacy and avoids any misuse of the system. And I'll talk about that in a few moments. And then, of course, over time, the expectation is that the use of smartphones and the levels of digital literacy will increase. And so there will be more of a move to use a smartphone app, a dedicated smartphone app. And for example, there are elements that we've talked about in terms of that WhatsApp usage that could equally be built into that kind of app on a smartphone that would, make access that bit simpler. So that's access as a kind of a key component, and that would be supported by members of the collective, the sort of leaders and people that have been trained up. The next element is registration. And that registration is about membership of that collective, of that organization. But in this case, we're talking about the issue of a digital identity that firstly recognizes that that worker is a member of that collective and therefore is starting that process of recognition as a worker. Secondly, that digital identity makes it possible to start to record and manage different types of data for an individual that is controlled by the individual. And what we're referring to here is known as decentralized identity. And there are two elements. There's the identifier itself, and there's something that we call verifiable credentials, which is like a digital certificate. And that can be used to, for example, capture training and skills accreditation as part of that upskilling process that we've already referred to. It could be used as for establishing a credit history that might help in terms of applying for loans, as we've already talked about in the context of the need to make ends meet and delays in payments, and at times the needs to take out loans. And so this mechanism would assist in providing that audit trail, but in a way that it can be used in a wider context. And then there's various services and capabilities that we've talked about already. So the training and skills accreditation, the credit history, and that data reporting, but also such things as the grievance management process, where there's a mechanism for capturing grievances and seeking redressal. And that would be managed at a collective level, but could then be escalated to the relevant brands and the relevant suppliers as appropriate. Now, that could be done in a general way via the web portal, but could also be escalated directly to a particular supplier or brand in that context, based on knowing who a particular worker or member is working for, and therefore you can do that. So Lucy mentioned the issue of mapping the supply chain. That would probably be a prerequisite to this facility. However, once mapped, this mechanism for regular reporting would be able to keep that mapping up to date on a regular basis. And so we've got this sort of idea of a set of functions based around a digital identity. This capability could then be made available to other organizations, community-based organizations, worker-based organizations, in such a way that there is a common standard, and over time that portal that gives the visibility on what is happening at the bottom of the supply chain, provides a richer picture based on location, based on collective, and ability to be able to look at the data in a number of different ways via a dashboard or something similar. So that sort of outlines the the basic approach. Obviously, with time, it's been difficult to go into too much detail. What I want to do is just sort of cut to the digital supply chain element, and this is based on the fact that if you've already got this mechanism for capturing data on a regular basis from the informal workers who are part of a collective, and this is available across a sort of a number of different locations, then the step towards automating the supply chain becomes that much easier, because that basic digital identity, that basic mechanism for reporting, can then be used to support a more interactive digital supply chain, which would then allow the tracking of orders and jobs associated with packs of garments or similar to be tracked through their life in the supply chain and being returned back to the manufacturer. And that could also facilitate the potential for automated payments. It could support the ability for discovery in terms of understanding what work is available and what capacity is available within the supply chain. And all of that is supported by a number of worker-based organizations that are, if you like, representing them and empowering them to operate within the supply chain in a much more visible and much more empowered manner, so that whole supply chain starts to become more efficient, and it's very clear how work is distributed, who is taking a margin, etc., etc. We recognise that this digital supply chain is going to take some time to be realised, but we see it as the most practical approach in terms of taking things forwards. And I think it's consistent with many of the comments that have been made in terms of the challenges faced by all the supply chain actors, but in particular those informal workers and that need for organisation and representation.
Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, at that level, I will leave it there, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Nick. And without much ado, we're going to get into the Q&A. And the first question that comes here is actually for Nick from Thomas. Thomas asks why the supply chain mapping is a prerequisite to set up grievance mechanisms. Can't we set up a mechanism with a landscape approach? So do you want to take that question, Nick, quickly?
Yes, certainly. So one of the issues with a grievance mechanism is if you start with a top-down approach, then typically it will only be available to those workers for which you have visibility and you are in contact with. So the point about this is that by facilitating it bottom up, that enables those informal workers that hitherto were hidden to be made visible and to have access to that. And because of the issues in terms of access, they will need help and support, which is why the collective-led intervention makes sense in that context. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Nick. Are there any other questions anybody else would like to ask a question? If so, you can unmute yourself and address the question. We still have a few moments, so we can take a couple of quick questions before the final summary.
I think apart from question, Lakshmi, I think apart from question, we also welcome suggestions and opinions, or yeah.
Sure, but really short and quickly. So, yeah.
Yeah, hello. This is Karpusamy from Reed, Tirupur region in India. I like to one small comment. Yeah, India in South Asia, we cannot ignore the caste system like in European racial system. So therefore, the caste systems created even textile private supply chain. There's a discrimination, recruitment, where they're working, even accommodation, where they're eating. There are several discrimination happening in textile supply chain. Therefore, with the brands due diligence, we have to look at seriously this caste-based discrimination. How we are looking is a gender-based issues, harassment, and some other things we have to include. This is very important. Also, COVID created so much child labor in 3 times in Tamil Nadu, in Pondicherry, as per our survey. We have to think about that, how we are going to address, and again, this is a textile supply chain. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. You're right. I think Sarhan has already written to you about child labor possibilities. But yes, coming to your point, I think vulnerabilities can be defined in many ways. Gender is one lens, caste is another, and there are so many others. So when we look at worker vulnerabilities, all of these are kind of included. So thank you for that point. Anybody else? Okay, so we would love for you to, whoever's interested on issues like this, to stay connected, and you will have, yes, there you go. Here is the contact information. So now I'd like to call upon Nikki to do the final summary yes, to bring this to a conclusion. Nikki, over to you.
Before we conclude, can I just mention that please continue to send the question in the chat. If we can't answer it, we will answer it afterwards. And also feel free to email us. I think one of the things that if there's no questions, I personally want to actually ask some questions. As we know that this meeting, we have some very nice mix of people attending. So including investors, ESG experts, and then researchers and different NGOs, etc. So one of the very important questions that we have here is to people like David, another ESG group, is like, now that you have listened to all the people been presenting, it'll be very nice to get your feedback about how do you think that we should capture some of the information that might be useful for the consideration when you are doing your screening, whether positive screen or negative screen. Another question that I have as the project leader for the Turing project is that at some point, personally, I think it would be very nice to have some smaller group meetings. For example, maybe with a bunch of platform people, or maybe with a bunch of suppliers, or with a bunch of brands, etc., to have a kind of collective views about how to take this forward. So the other thing, for example, when we talk about platform, one thing we learned from the COVID crisis is like when you're sharing information around the world, there might be some template that we call the schemas. So in this case, I know that there is also a person from ILO. So organization like ILO, would it be useful for ILO to also take part or take a lead to think about what sort of information will be useful to pass around between regions or between supply chains, even between supply actors, etc. Okay, so I think that's all my own question. That's it. Yeah.
Thank you.
So,
thank you.
Nikki.
All right. Yes.
I think Imran Karai in the chat would like to speak in Urdu, and
I think
please do go ahead, Imranji, yeah, and then we can translate.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Imran. I am from Pakistan. Sindh से मेरा ताल्लुक है और यहाँ पे मैंने मैसेज में भी जो ना वो डिटेल जोग्राफिकल वो SMS में अपना चैट में वो भी शेयर किए। 2010 से होमनेट पाकिस्तान के साथ होम बेस्ड वर्कर्स पे हमारा काम चल रहा है और उनकी हम जो भी हो सकती है वो कोशिश करते हैं कि इनको वो जो है अपने इनकी जो प्रोडक्ट्स वगैरह हैं वो उनको करें। उनका सारा जो डिपेंड करता है वो उनकी जो है ना हैंडमेड चीज़ों पे उनका सहारा है सारी चीज़ों का। और यहाँ पे
आपकी आवाज गई इमरान जी। इमरान जी आप सुन सकते हैं हम क्या कह रहे हैं? I think the connection is probably a little weak.
Maybe we should go ahead with Nikki.
Yeah. Yes, Nikki, let's come to you.